Section 4 builds on the Introductory Learning Module 6, Planning for Climate Change, focusing on planning at the sub-national level. This type of planning is important because the effects of climate change are felt locally. Planning and investment decisions are often taken at the sub-national level. There is increasing urbanization, and climate change impacts the services local institutions provide. Section 4 discusses the importance of integrating climate change into urban planning and describes what the different approaches for this are. Good urban planning and climate change adaptation and mitigation are connected. The previous sections have highlighted some of the ways in which urban planning can address climate change. For instance, transport planning that supports public transport can reduce emissions. This section will explain in more detail how urban planning can help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make cities more resilient. The quote in this slide refers to how good urban planning and planning for climate change are connected. In fact, urban planners' responsibilities are generally consistent with planning for climate change. The examples given by the UN Habitat Guide, Planning for Climate Change 2014 are minimizing risk and improving land development activities occurring in areas that are in or near coastal slope or flooded areas. Improving infrastructure, for example, for stormwater management and solid and liquid waste management, as well as access to safe drinking water. Protecting ecosystems and environmentally sensitive areas in urban and peri-urban areas. Improving disaster risk reduction and encouraging local economic development. There are advantages and disadvantages to the different approaches. However, mainstreaming helps to ensure continuous consideration of climate change and is not limited to one-off interventions. Ad hoc approaches focus on a specific issue to be addressed and are sometimes retroactive, i.e., responding to an existing issue. In addition, these approaches do not use a complete planning process, but rather focus on one opportunity at a time. Standalone plans focus on climate change and can address either adaptation or mitigation or both. A specific plan is written, which often includes an implementation strategy. Mainstreaming means incorporating climate change into existing plans, policies and programs. There are advantages and disadvantages to the different approaches. However, mainstreaming helps to ensure continuous consideration of climate change that is not limited to one-off interventions. Climate change affects many different aspects of cities and people's lives. Consequently, climate change should be considered in almost any type of urban policy, plan or program. Incorporating climate change considerations can improve the effectiveness of these plans, as well as ensuring that the city is prepared for climate change and takes measures to mitigate its contribution to climate change. Mainstreaming helps to ensure that climate change considerations are not only taken into account for a specific amount of time. The UN Habitat Guide, Planning for Climate Change 2014, provides guidance to city planners and other professionals on how to plan for climate change and mainstream climate change actions into physical, spatial, sectoral and broader development plans at the local level. This is not an exhaustive list of the types of plans in which climate change can be mainstreamed. In fact, Climate change can be included in almost any type of plan. Transport plan. This type of plan improves infrastructure and connections related to transport. Mainstreaming climate change can mean, for example, identifying the potential climate change impacts on transport networks and the improvements that are needed, and undertaking climate change mitigation efforts such as reducing emissions through supporting public transport. Town or city plan. This plan identifies different zones for different types of development, such as commercial or housing. Climate change can be mainstreamed in different ways. For example, the plan can identify zones which are particularly affected by climate change. These types of plans can also increase awareness of the impacts of climate change on the city and the contribution to climate change of the city, and can change policy direction. Public health plan. It focuses on disease prevention and public safety improvements. Mainstreaming climate change into this type of plan could include identifying health risks related to climate change and facilitating mitigating those. Energy management plan. This plan improves energy generation options, distribution and conservation. Mainstreaming climate change into this plan could involve identifying risks to energy generation and distribution facilities and supporting climate change mitigation, for instance through energy efficiency measures. Disaster risk reduction plan. This plan examines how prepared the city is for disasters and improves early warning systems and capacities. Disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and mitigation have some overlaps. Disaster risk reduction plans can examine climate change related disaster risks and adaptive capacity. It is important to gather reliable data that will then be used in the urban planning process, aiming at adaptation to and mitigation of the impact of climate change. This slide shows the modules of the planning process for climate change presented in the UN Habitat Guide, Planning for Climate Change 2014. Each of the modules will be addressed in turn. The modules are supported by planning tools that are contained in a toolkit accompanying the guide. The planning process is flexible and non-linear. Cities may be in different stages of climate change planning, use the Planning for Climate Change Guide for different purposes, have different planning structures, processes and authorities, and have different resources and capacities. The 3 steps of this module help planners to address the following key questions. Step 1. Are we ready to undertake a climate change planning process? Step 2. Who needs to be involved in the city and in the community, and how can they be engaged? Step 3. How is climate change affecting the city, and who is most vulnerable to these changes? Each of the steps contain a number of tasks, and the guide provides valuable tools to support the completion of tasks. This first module will enable planners and other stakeholders to have a shared, clear awareness of the need to address climate change in their city, know which city, community and local stakeholders to involve, and how to do it by completing their stakeholder and engagement plan. Understand what is happening with climate change in the city through the creation of a vulnerability assessment, including where to source the information required for it. Module B contains 1 step. Step 4. What community and local stakeholder issues must be considered in addition to any existing city objectives when selecting and prioritising climate change options, and how can they be identified? This module will enable planners and stakeholders to have a clear list of existing city development objectives from other plans and strategies that must also be considered and used as part of the climate change planning initiative. A clear understanding of local community issues and objectives, which may or may not be addressed by city planning objectives, and which ones matter most to the community. An understanding of which objectives at city level and local community level are most affected by and relevant to climate change adaptation planning. Indicators with which to compare and measure the objectives so they can be used to evaluate and prioritise climate change adaptation options. Module C has the following 3 planning steps. Step 5. What options are there to respond to climate change in our city? Step 6. How can we assess, screen and choose the best options to ensure resources, time and capacity are used most effectively and efficiently? Step 7. How can we best implement the prioritised climate change options and assemble a climate change action plan? This module leads to an achievable, comprehensive and integrated climate change action plan. After completing Module C, planners and stakeholders will have identified, screened, assessed and prioritised climate change adaptation actions such as projects, policies, programmes and actions according to local objectives and vulnerabilities. Developed a standalone climate change action plan with a clear implementation framework and/or mainstreamed and integrated climate actions into existing policy instruments, plans and programmes where practical and feasible. Module D, Are we doing it?, is a fundamental part of measuring the success of climate change planning processes and the Climate Change Action Plan. This last module contains 2 planning steps. Step 8. How can the progress of the Climate Change Action Plan be tracked to ensure it is having the anticipated impact and that stakeholders are doing what they agreed to do? Step 9. How should new information be incorporated into the Climate Change Action Plan and how should other changes be made? After this module, planners and stakeholders will have a clear understanding of what monitoring and evaluation are and why they are critical to the successful implementation of a climate change action plan. Developed a monitoring and evaluation program for the Climate Change Action Plan to monitor implementation progress, evaluate actions against plan objectives, i.e., is it making a difference, and share results with stakeholders. Developed a clear timeline for formal Climate Change Action Plan reviews. This video by UN Habitat shows how Cambodia's coastal city of Prea Sihanouk is planning for climate change and how climate change should be mainstreamed into existing planning processes.
Climate change is fast becoming one of the most significant challenges of the 21st century. As centres of economic, political and cultural activity, cities must play an important role in designing and implementing climate change adaptation and mitigation actions. Cambodia's coastal city of Prea Sihanouk is making positive strides to build their resilience amidst a changing climate.
វាជាការសំខាន់ណាស់ដែលយើងត្រូវការពារទីក្រុងរបស់យើងឲ្យរួចផុតពីគ្រោះមហន្តរាយទាំងឡាយនិងផលប៉ះពាល់នៃការប្រែប្រួលអាកាសធាតុបើមិនដូច្នេះទេយើងនឹងអាចជួបនៅបញ្ហាសេដ្ឋកិច្ចសុខុមាលភាពប្រជាពលរដ្ឋរបស់យើង
So Sihanoukville is a very strategic city for Cambodia. It's the location of Cambodia's only sea port, which means that all many imports and exports come through Sihanoukville.
តំបន់ខេត្តព្រះសីហនុយើងបានន័យថាជាទីក្រុងទេសចរមួយដែលមានធនធានធម្មជាតិយ៉ាងសម្បូរបែប
In order to assist urban planners, UN Habitat created a strategic planning guide that can be used to address climate change impacts in cities. Through the process, planners will be able to better meet the needs of the community and build a more economically, environmentally and socially sustainable city.
Planning for climate change is participatory, which means that it supports a broad number of local stakeholders to become involved in the planning process and ensures that the planning process meets as many different objectives as possible. It seeks to understand the local values and objectives that people have in the local area. It encourages planners to make the best use of the resources that they have available to them. It's aligned with and implemented through existing plans and processes at the city level.
The first phase of planning for climate change is crucial as it builds the foundation for the entire planning process. It focuses on getting organised, planning, establishing which stakeholders to engage, and understanding climate change through a vulnerability assessment. At the completion of this phase, it will be clear what is happening, how climate change is affecting their city, why they should do something about it, and who should be involved in that process. In the case of Sihanoukville, the vulnerability assessment revealed that people who live in low-income coastal areas are most vulnerable to climate change. Their vulnerability is driven by a dependence on climate-sensitive livelihoods, such as fishing and tourism, and exacerbated by low incomes, poor quality housing, a lack of information on climate change, and infrastructural challenges.
ក្នុងរយៈពេលប្រមាណឆ្នាំកន្លងមកនេះឃើញថាតំបន់ឆ្នេរនៅក្រុងម៉ាស៊ីនុភាគច្រើនត្រូវបានហូរច្រោះដោយខ្សាច់ដោយការប្រែប្រួលអាកាសធាតុពីការកើនឡើងនៃកម្ពស់ទឹកសមុទ្រក៏ដូចជាការខ្យល់ព្យុះធំៗ
What we found was that local people were relying on Thai and Vietnamese radio for weather information, and as a result they weren't getting accurate weather information when they went out in the fishing boats.
ការសិក្សានេះគឺមានសារៈប្រយោជន៍ណាស់សម្រាប់អាជ្ញាធរខេត្តក៏ដូចជាអាជ្ញាធរក្រុងសម្រាប់យកផលប៉ះពាល់ទាំងអស់នេះទៅរៀបចំផែនការក្នុងការអនុវត្ត
The next phase of the process answers the question, what matters most? Supported by UN Habitat, the Sihanoukville local authorities set out to prioritise the challenges, asking questions like which issues matter most to the community, which climate change impacts have the largest effect on the economy. This was done through a participatory approach, involving focus group discussions and consultations with various stakeholders. At the end of this process, there were clear objectives to reduce the vulnerability in the fishery sector, improve sanitation, protect the environment, strengthen the tourism industry, and build more capacity for strategic planning on climate change.
បាទបើចំពោះអ្នកដទៃគេគិតថាมันសំខាន់បើចំពោះខ្ញុំគិតថាខ្ញុំសំខាន់ព្រោះថាខ្ញុំអត់មានអ្វីដែលថាខ្ញុំអាចរកផ្សេងកាត់ព្រោះថាខ្ញុំកើតមកវាកូនជាអ្នកអត់បានខ្ញុំរើសជ្រើសរើសការនេសាទហ្នឹងជាមុខរបរដ៏ធំចំពោះខ្ញុំថាឲ្យខ្ញុំចេញទៅហ្នឹងដោយថាចេញទៅដោយថាយើងទៅហេងសយទៅតែចៃដន្យដោយថាទៅរកបើសិនជាប៉ះខ្យល់គេអាចត្រឡប់វិញកើតអ្នកខ្លះក៏អាចមកបន្តកើត
The third phase of the Planning for Climate Change Guide answers the question, what can we do about it? To act on the priorities agreed upon with the community, the local authorities decided to set up an automatic weather station, create a better waste management system, protect the beach against erosion through a zoning plan, rehabilitate mangrove forests, and improve climate change understanding through a series of trainings with the local authorities. Following the 2010 vulnerability assessment, With the help from UN Habitat, the provincial authority successfully applied for funding from the Cambodia Climate Change Alliance to implement these locally designed climate change adaptation actions.
ក្រោយពីគេដំឡើងដងព្យាករណ៍ធាតុអាកាសនៅខេត្តផ្សេងនោះខ្ញុំអាចធ្វើឲ្យជីវិតខ្ញុំប្រសើរមិនអាចមានផលប៉ះពាល់ផលលំបាកអីមួយដែលផ្សេងៗដែលថាពីខ្យល់ព្យុះហ្នឹងសោះខ្ញុំបានពិនិត្យឃើញថាតូបបណ្ដាលទាំងឡាយដែលនៅតាមតំបន់ឆ្នេរក្នុងអូជាទៀលហ្នឹងឃើញគឺពីមុនគឺមានភាពរញ៉េរញ៉ៃប៉ុន្តែក្រោយពីអនុវត្តគម្រោងយើងឃើញថាយើងបានកាត់បន្ថយរុញតូបពីតូបអាជីវករទាំងនោះឲ្យចាក់ចេញពីឆ្នេរសមុទ្រ5ទៅ7ម៉ែត្រអត់ទាន់បានកិលគឺថាហាងដូចចិត្តជាប់សមុទ្រអញ្ចឹងពេលភ្លៀងមកខ្យល់មកវាប៉ះពាល់អញ្ចឹងយើងជាជីវករវាភ័យវាបាក់កន្លែងបាក់អីយ៉ាងទៀតបាក់លក់ដល់ឥឡូវហាងគាត់រៀបចំមកក្រោយអញ្ចឹងអត់មានប៉ះពាល់អីល្អយើងឃើញថា UN Habitat បានជួយនៅកសាងសមត្ថភាពដល់មន្ត្រីអនុវត្តគម្រោងក៏ដូចជាដល់មន្ត្រីនៅក្នុងក្រុងប្រស៊ីនុដើម្បីឲ្យមានចំណេះដឹងបាទពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយនឹងកិច្ចការក្នុងការរៀបចំផែនការទៅលើការងារប្រែប្រួលអាកាសធាតុនេះ
The final phase in the process answers the question, are we doing it? Planning for climate change guides local authorities to monitor and evaluate the process so that lessons learned can be applied towards current and future planning and projects at the local and also national level.
គម្រោងបំរើបម្រួលអាកាសធាតុយើងកត់សម្គាល់ឃើញថានៅក្រុងប្រសិនុឥឡូវនេះមានភាពងាយរងគ្រោះតិចតួចជាងមុនពីការរងនៅឥទ្ធិពលនៃការបំបែបម្រួលអាកាសធាតុ
Fundamentally, good planning practices are also climate-smart planning practices. The officials of Sihanoukville understand that climate change planning takes a long-term view and must be mainstreamed into the overall planning process in order to reap sustainable benefits. UN Habitat is working to support local authorities to integrate and mainstream climate change with existing planning instruments and development activities across all sectors.
Through working with Sihanoukville, we've demonstrated that local government is a capable and important implementing partner, and therefore we can work with other towns and cities in Cambodia and show that they too are important implementing partners in climate change.
Consider the following quote from the video. Local government is a capable and important implementing partner. This highlights the fact that local governments are and should be central actors in taking action on climate change, and that urban adaptation and mitigation are key issues. Funding is a key part of action on climate change and on deciding which mitigation and adaptation measures to take. However, new funding may need to be mobilised and existing resources may need to be redirected in order to fund mitigation and adaptation efforts. There are a number of efforts to increase the availability of financial resources for local climate action. For example, the city's Climate Finance Leadership Alliance was launched at the UN Secretary-General's Climate Change Summit in 2014, with the aim of accelerating investments in climate-smart urban infrastructure. This slide features some of the different options for increasing funding for local adaptation and mitigation efforts. The first option is from the UN Habitat's guide, planning for climate change. The other options are based on the chapter on cities in the New Climate Economy 2014 report, which discusses a number of options for increasing city financing, focusing on smarter infrastructure. Low regrets options. UN Habitat's Planning for Climate Change publication encourages planners to consider low regrets adaptation options. These options, also known as no regrets options, contribute to wider development objectives than climate change. The benefits from those wider development objectives are worthwhile even before considering climate change related benefits. Redirecting funds. Funding can be redirected from business as usual urban infrastructure development. For example, the bus rapid transit system in Bogota, Colombia, benefited from redirecting funds from urban highway programs. Municipal bonds. Large institutional investors are generally not interested in investing in small individual projects. Municipal bonds allow cities to finance a group of projects. The collective assets of these projects underwrite the bond. For example, Johannesburg has issued 4 municipal bonds to finance capital expenditure. In addition to municipal bonds, there are other ways to package smaller projects. For example, cities can establish pooled financial mechanisms between cities, or exchanges or vehicles to match infrastructure projects with investors or financing. The Chicago Infrastructure Trust is an example of the latter. Use of land value capture. Land value capture refers to financing the construction of new transport infrastructure through the increase in land values that this new infrastructure would promote. There are several different types of use of land value capture. For example, development impact fees, public land leasing, and land readjustment programs. Reform of multilateral funding. Multilateral funding could be reformed. At the moment, multilateral development banks often offer support to cities on a sector-by-sector basis, rather than through more comprehensive, holistic approaches. Cities could also be given greater access to multilateral development bank funding. Support for project preparation. International support for project preparation and financing deals can be useful, as cities may not have the expertise to prepare projects that are attractive for private sector investors. Enhanced creditworthiness. Poor credit ratings are an important factor contributing to lack of financing for large-scale urban infrastructure. The City Creditworthiness Initiative of the World Bank works with cities to improve their creditworthiness by strengthening financial performance, developing and enabling legal, regulatory, institutional, and policy framework, developing sound climate-smart projects, and by engaging with private sector investors. Greater budgetary control. Greater budgetary control for cities could enable them to leverage the co-financing that is often required for large-scale urban infrastructure investment projects. This slide features some of the funds available for urban adaptation and mitigation. Examples of multilateral sources are in blue, UNFCCC in red, and bilateral in orange. National sources and market instruments are in green. The multilateral and bilateral sources are from www.climatefinanceoptions.org and from UNFCCC's Adaptation Funding Interface on funding for adaptation and mitigation in urban areas. These funds include urban populations and human settlements as specific sectors of interest. The list is not exhaustive, but rather shows examples of funding options. Funds can also be mobilised from national sources, such as through tax revenues, use of land value capture, and redirecting funds. Market instruments include green municipal bonds mentioned in the previous slide and carbon finance. Carbon finance refers to the use of market-based mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Develop Mechanism, CDM, and Joint Implementation, JI, or other mechanisms such as the Regional EU Emissions Trading Scheme, EU ETS. Few CDM projects in cities have been registered. The World Bank, A Citywide Approach to Carbon Finance, 2010.